Welcome to Morning Message for March the 18th. Many years ago, when I was rector of the parish of Port Hawkesbury with Ayrshire, what I experienced there was a wonderful parish, wonderful people, by the way. But what I experienced there was, Port Hawkesbury was kind of centrally located. Ayrshire was about a 35-minute drive. Antigonish was a 35-minute drive in the other direction, and that's where the hospital was, or that's where one of the hospitals was. And I was on a few diocesan committees which met in Halifax. Effectively, that meant I spent a lot of time on the road. And this was before the time we could have CD players in our cars. And in the wintertime, the tapes would freeze and you couldn't really use them much in the wintertime. And I didn't always want to listen to them anyway. So I had 5 buttons on my radio. One of them was for the local radio station CIGO, and the other 4 were for CBC stations between Sydney and Halifax. Depending on where I was, I could push one of those buttons and usually pick up the nearest CBC signal. I couldn't always. There are a few dips where I couldn't find a CBC radio station. But so I had the 5 buttons. One was local radio. The other 4 were CBC signals from Sydney to Halifax. But there were even times when I wasn't particularly interested in one of those, whatever story was being dealt with on CBC. So I'd turn the radio off. And I discovered that I was kind of half remembering bits of poems that I liked. Most of them out of this book here. And I know Riley's going to recognize this book. You can see how I've used it a lot. But I gave it to Riley a few years ago. This is my copy, which I gave to her. I knew where it was in her room, so I didn't have to go rooting at all. It was out, obviously, on a shelf. But this was a book that I've read from beginning to end. It's called Every Man's Book of Nonsense. It's not all poetry. There's some prose in here as well. But I found myself half remembering poems. There's one that I remembered all the way through. It was by Giles Brandreth, and it was called Ode to My Goldfish. Oh, wet pet. So that's the kind of nonsense poetry that I like. Perhaps my favorite, if I can find it quickly, it's called What Nonsense, and it goes like this. One fine October morning in September last July, the moon lay thick upon the ground, the snow shone in the sky. The flowers were singing gaily, and the birds were in full bloom. I went down to the cellar to sweep the upstairs room. So those are just 2 poems out of this book, Every Man's Book of Nonsense. One of my favorite books, and one of my favorite pastimes is reading nonsense poetry, and I've written a little bit as well. The reason I'm sharing that with you today is I was thinking about the pandemic, and we've been a year, and we're coming up on anniversaries now. And early in the pandemic, there was a few of us that were still trying to put together some kind of worship service to be live streamed on Sunday morning. So in the early days, there were just 3 of us in the church, Claire, Joel, and myself. Then eventually Elizabeth joined us, and then soloists joined us, and once in a while there might be another reader that was there as well. But it was usually never more than 4 or 5 people in the building on a Sunday morning. And one of our first activities as we were setting up was to do a sound check to make sure our mics were working with the special equalizer that we had so that the sound would be okay on the smartphone for broadcast. So it wasn't just a check 1 2, check 1 2 that we did. We needed to do an extended thing. So at first I would just read the lesson that was on the piece of paper before me. But eventually I started half remembering these poems, and that's what I would be reciting into the mics as we were doing the mic check for Sunday mornings. I've been a part of conversations in recent weeks about what sustained us during the pandemic, or for the first year of the pandemic. And I've named a number of things because I've had a number of things that have helped sustain me. But the other day it dawned on me that I didn't go to one of my, or at least I thought I didn't go to one of my standby things, and that's nonsense poetry. It's been a comfort for decades, reading and writing nonsense poetry. I didn't turn to that this year. And then it dawned on me that actually I had, because every Sunday morning I would recite what I could remember from a nonsense poem into the microphone so that we had an extended thing that we could do adjustments to. And there were a few Sundays when I went to church with one already in my head, so I was actually prepared to do this. So in a way, nonsense poetry still continues to sustain me in the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of any kind of trouble I face. We all have things that we rely on, and often, usually, they're very healthy things for us to rely on during difficult times. And so I encourage you to reach out for those things. If it's a book of nonsense poetry or serious poetry, reading Shakespeare, reading a dime novel, calling out to a friend, reaching out to a friend, or a favorite TV show, your favorite YouTuber, whatever it is that helps sustain you through difficult times. I encourage you to do that because it's really important for us to keep our spirits up for ourselves and for those around us. And maybe we can look back in the future, we can look back on these troubling days and see what sustained us, see what brought us life and brought us joy and brought us light, and celebrate those things. So that's my hope and prayer for all of us, that we reach out to whatever it is that helps sustain us in these times, and receive that blessing. God bless.